Hello and welcome to The Toughest Choice. I'm Stephanie Reynolds. Today's guest on The Toughest Choice is Jean Boes, and Jean is the CEO of Northwest Center and has been since 2017 after being on their board of directors for 3 years. And previously, Jean has been a management consultant and was leading as principal for Seattle office, the North Highland Company, and he's got background also as an adjunct professor at Seattle Pacific University, Seattle University, and is a mentor for the Albers School of Business. He's got quite a long management consulting career before that at Loft 9, Deloitte, and was at Microsoft for 14 years after serving in the U.S. Navy for 9 years. Throughout his career, Jean has been an active participant in the community and nonprofit world and served on the board of the directors for Cure Autism Now. Jean and his wife, June, are parents of 2 adult children, son Andrew and daughter Tori. And Tori, who has autism, is also a client of Northwest Center Employment Services. Welcome to The Toughest Choice and welcome to Jean Boes. Thank you for joining me today, Jean.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Jean, can you tell us a little bit about Northwest Center?
Well, let me start by telling you the foundations of Northwest Center started in 1965 by 4 Seattle moms who were told their children didn't belong in school or church or the community and should be put in institutions. And those 4 moms rightly stood up and said, you know what, our children can learn, they can be contributing citizens, so we're going to go our own way. And they did. They started Northwest Center, started educating their children. And after a couple of years, they took stock of their progress and their children were learning just like they expected. So knowing that, given the opportunity and suspending disbelief or the barriers that society puts around people, they proved that their children could be contributing citizens. But they looked around Seattle and the community and realized there were so many other kids that weren't given that opportunity. And they basically said, this needs to change. So they grabbed a couple law interns from the University of Washington and they wrote House Bill 90. And when I say they wrote the bill, they wrote the bill. They didn't have the legislators write the bill. They wrote it to make sure it was right. And that got passed in 1971. Washington Education for All. That says that every child has the right to an education. And now it helps that their cousin, the cousin of one of those founding mothers, was Governor Dan Evans. And he helped them navigate the process in Olympia. So it was an enormous amount of work, but they certainly had help. And then after passing here, it was the blueprint for national legislation. So I use that foundation to talk about Northwest Center because our mission is to promote the growth, development, and independence of people with disabilities through programs of therapy, education, and work opportunity. So what does all that mean? That means for Northwest Center, to honor the legacy of our founding mothers is to do what needs to be done. If something needs to change, don't wait for someone else to do it, lean in and do it. And so today, it extends beyond just education. So it's really education, employment opportunity, engagement with the community. So it's the privilege and the right to live a full life. And for people with disabilities, the way Northwest Center is committed to doing that is to eliminate ableism. So that is the vision of the organization. It's to lean in and do what's needed, not what's funded or what society currently stipulates that they think needs to be done. It's really to create the inclusive world we all deserve.
Oh, that's fantastic. And never underestimate the power of mothers. That's one of the things I'm taking away quickly.
Yeah.
I think also, though, that message about being determined, gathering forces, and making change is one of those characteristics that I think leaders that are paying attention to this really need to recognize that we have a lot of power.
Yep, agreed. And what I would add to that for the inspiration that the founding mothers give to me as well is this idea that if you recognize that something's not right, that don't wait for someone else to do the work. Just lean in and do the work. And today in the world around us, and I think this is true always, is that there are enormous challenges that we all have to deal with as leaders and as humans to just take the first step. So Janet Taggart, I had the privilege of spending a considerable amount of time with Janet, who was our last surviving founding mother. And every time I would try to talk about how impressive it was with the things that they accomplished, she would stop and with humility and say, you know what, we just did what needed to be done. So she deferred all of that credit and said that this was because it was a community effort. So for leaders, recognize that it's hard work, but what's the alternative? Don't do nothing. Lean in and do the work. The work is the work. Gather people around you that can help with it and then continue to move it forward.
Thank you. That's a great message, and I think it so embodies who you are. I'm also curious about the feedback you get from folks that benefit from employing those that have disabilities. And because I think that's something sometimes the general population is not as aware of. And I've had a great experience at working inside organizations, other organizations like Microsoft, for example, and Amazon and other organizations that have employed those with disabilities and had great results. And even in my past leadership life, we were employing those with disabilities intentionally. So I'd just love to hear some of that feedback that you've gotten.
So from employers, I think some of the context that I'd want to add to at the beginning, from a personal perspective, I have a adult daughter with a disability. My wife now has a disability. My father had late onset multiple sclerosis, so he had a disability starting at age 40. So I've had this
Wow.
experience with disability personally that has allowed me to take this approach. And the approach that I take when I talk to an audience, any audience, but employers in particular, in this case, is that what's in it for them? So I try not to say, I really believe in inclusion. And I really believe that until all of us are allowed to engage and contribute, none of us reach our potential. But it doesn't mean a lot, in my opinion, to go to an employer and say, you need to be inclusive because of why I think it's important. So I try to understand what's important for them. And the gist of it is we solve business problems. So we can help you with attrition, absenteeism, productivity, quality, and safety. So you get enormous business value if you would suspend your disbelief and be curious about how do you tap into the ability that the disability community has. So take advantage of talent that you're not currently taking advantage of and take that step. And for me, the approach, again, is about the business value that brings. Now, with Northwest Center, a lot of the credibility comes from having now 6 different commercial businesses where we employ people with disabilities. It's not that you win in spite of inclusion, you win because of inclusion. So we have that return on investment data that says this is why it's important for you to be inclusive. And yes, I could say that it's the right thing to do and it's socially responsible. And from a moral perspective, it's important for you to do that. But the truth is, it's good for business. And so that is the proof point that we take to employers. And in fairness, some of them are resistant or skeptical. And honestly, they are the biggest fans once they've taken that leap of faith, hired someone with a disability, because it's about ability and skill. It's not about disability. It doesn't make them any less capable to deliver the work that needs to be done. It's the accommodation and the environment that needs to be addressed to make sure that they can bring their best self to work.
That's beautiful and a great lesson. And I think the ROI, that return on investment, is always, whether it's a moral investment, a community investment, or a business investment, will always be what speaks to people when we're asking or encouraging them to take a look at something done differently. And so
Right.
I really appreciate that. I'd love to pivot to you and more about you and talk a little bit about, if you would, with us, what drew you into your leadership journey. I know you've had a big background before coming to Northwest Center. We talked about that at the top of the program, but I would really love to hear from you what your leadership journey has been like for those that can learn from you.
Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. I don't like talking about myself necessarily, but it's fun to talk about this in terms of the storytelling component of it. So I grew up in a family with 9 siblings. So there were 10 of us. I
Wow.
was the second oldest. So at a very early age, I had a chance to lead. And so that's how I thought about it. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was the de facto leader of all the kids in my family. And then from there, I was very involved in sports throughout my life into college. Then I joined the Navy. I was part of a squadron. I flew for the Navy, flew off aircraft carriers, had the chance to lead and be given more and more responsibility in the Navy. And then from there, moved into the civilian world, starting consulting and with Deloitte Consulting that got me back out to Seattle. But for me, it wasn't an intention to lead at an early age. I didn't have that thought process, but I was given a lot of opportunity. And for me, the way it was described fairly early in my career was, what is a leader? A leader is someone who has followers. That's really it. So when you think about it, if you're going to have followers, you better inspire them. And so for me, then the leadership qualities that I tried to adopt were really, it's really about servant leadership and allowing people to bring their best self to work. And so for me, that's been the journey from a leadership perspective, is to not focus on myself, but focus on what is the mission, or what are we really trying to accomplish, and how do I get more people rallied and inspired and empowered to deliver on that mission. So that's a little bit about my personal leadership journey.
Well, I want to dig in just a little bit more if you'll bear with me. I know you're uncomfortable talking about yourself, which is one of those selfless qualities that I appreciate about you. And I think that there's something, yeah, you got to have followers or you're not a leader. I think that leaders show up in different circumstances. What I'm hearing is there was a void, so you stepped in. You were de facto in your family. I can only imagine what was going on when you were flying for the Navy in those situations. And then I've had the good fortune of experiencing you with your organization in the last couple of years and seeing you support others. There's also something about grit, though, also, Jean. And I know you don't talk about it a lot, but I think that we get formed a lot by the pressures that we face and the environments when we're at great risk and potentially have a lot on the line that we could lose. And I'm wondering if anything comes to mind for you that might bubble up around what's created that persevering grit that I've seen in you, besides taking care of others, caring about what you're focused on, caring about the business and the community.
Yeah, for me, I guess the way I think about it, I'll go back to Janet Taggart and the founding mothers about doing what's needed. And part of their rationale was the current state is not acceptable. And so we're going to do something to change that. And I think, let me focus on disability, because that in the journey that I've been on there. And again, this is in hindsight. This isn't something that I just thought about in the moment of the life experience that I've had. But in hindsight, this is how I boiled down the commitment to disability. One, first, it's that from an organization perspective and the importance of leaning in. And when you talk about grit, it's about grind. It's about getting through it and persevering through really hard, complex, difficult scenarios. The truth is, if we don't do this, I live every day with my personal life of knowing how the world falls short for my daughter, for my wife, for my family. And for me, that's not acceptable. And so the sense of urgency for Northwest Center is knowing that even the families and clients that we work with aren't getting everything they need. We're doing our best, and the organization does amazing work, but there's more that needs to be done for those families. And there are other families who aren't getting support. So the sense of urgency is really driven around knowing, at least having empathy for the personal experience that these families are going through, and the support that they need. For me, it started as I think back to my father. I saw how the world treated my father when he was able. And then after he got his diagnosis and ended up in a wheelchair, I saw how the world looked at him as well when he was disabled. So this was an extraordinarily gifted human being who people perceived, I would believe, accurately in terms of the value that they have. And then that shifted simply because he had a disability and was in a wheelchair. It wasn't a different human at that point, but society looked at him differently. I've seen how society has looked at my daughter, and will say she's not capable. She's on the severe end of the autism spectrum. So she is profoundly impacted. But they put her in a box and believe that she's not capable of doing things. And then my wife was the nursing supervisor and a shift administrator at Children's Hospital for over 25 years. Extraordinarily gifted, incredibly respected, but the world went from looking at her with a great deal of respect and value to when she was diagnosed with Parkinson's to looking at her in a very different way. And so that for me is very problematic and unacceptable that the world looks at people with disabilities with the wrong lens. They're making a critique or a value judgment in the absence of being really well informed. So for me, that is, we all have value. From a disability perspective, someone might need an accommodation to be able to bring their best self to life, but everyone has incredible value. And I think that is what society misses. They're losing the opportunity to be the better version of themselves because they eliminate or exclude others from leaning in and engaging and contributing.
Wow, that's very compelling. I've talked to you a number of times and didn't realize how far back this goes for you in your life. How old were you when your father was not being respected before he became disabled? When did this start for you? How young were you?
So I was a sophomore in high school when he got his diagnosis. So it probably started when I was a freshman in high school and then got his diagnosis. And then several years after that. So from my high school through my college tenure, that's when this really started to escalate. And as a young person, I was really bitter that the world treated him the way they did. Like for me, he had all of his friends seemed to disappear. And that was really infuriating to me. I had the chance to talk to a couple of his friends later in life and ask them, this is after he had passed away, and asked them, why in the world did you do that? This is someone you valued so much. And I heard the way you talked about him before he got his diagnosis. And one individual in particular that said, you know what, for me personally, I couldn't do it because I couldn't stand to see him in a wheelchair. So it was a very personal reaction and an inability to deal with that tragedy that my father went through. So I understood it a lot better. But for me, that, again, in retrospect, I recognized how that shifted, how he was treated shifted. And that, for me, is the core of what needs to change. We all need to think about the world in a different way, and we all need to react in a different way, I think, to different scenarios. If we're reacting where we're excluding, I think we need to rethink how we're behaving and perhaps behave differently.
Such a cogent example. I oftentimes we're so formed by these earlier experiences that drive us, and some people just feel they don't feel the power to do anything. And they get overwhelmed by the disappointments. They feel, and leaders feel this all the time. They just feel sometimes that they can't deal with all the adversity and all the layered resistance and obstacles that come their way. And I found that in working with leaders, and I'm sure you've seen this yourself in working with other leaders and those that work for you or with you, that there are those that talk about why they can't, and then there are those that move forward and try and do something about it, which is the big thread, I think, that's going through this conversation right now. Yeah. Yeah. And so it sounds like you took that bitterness, learned more. And I really appreciate what you said, Jean, about later on checking back in with a friend or two of his that you had seen as abandoning him or not helping anymore, disappearing, I think was the word you used. And checking back in with them to understand what was motivating them. And it's usually fear that I don't know how to be normal with you anymore. I don't know how to be with you anymore. It scares me that could happen to me. People are unconscious about this sort of thing. And I think that's true of disabled or those that have disability, right? That people are afraid that somehow they can't be normal or they can't be themselves or they are afraid it might happen to them. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair. And I think of a couple threads that I'd want to intersect in that. One is that the work is difficult, it's complex, it's hard, it's easy to get overwhelmed and just feel like you can't do it. And I think part of our opportunity as leaders is to rally more support. So nothing changed is about the situation or scenario. It's not any easier just by stepping back and giving it a moment. But if you can rally support and lead more people into the conversation or into the mix, now you've got a much better chance of actually solving the problem. So for me, this idea of suspending disbelief and being curious, I mean, that's one of the core things that I think about too. The way I'd relate that is that having that conversation and going back to that conversation that I had with my father's friend, for me, that sticks with me. It reminds me that I don't know what other individuals are going through in life. I want to be an informed leader. So I need to ask questions and check in. So I don't just assume from my father's friend, well, they just abandoned him because they didn't care about him. No, now I know why. There was a very visceral human reaction that's understandable to dig in more to that. So as leaders, checking back in with your people, for me, is one, do they really understand what we're trying to do? So don't take for granted that they remember. Constantly remind, this is our mission, this is what we're about, and continue to encourage and support them in their efforts. But then also check in with them. What are they going through in their journey in life to make sure that you accurately read what they're trying to do and what their obstacles are. So my job, I work for about 1,000 people. My job is to make sure they can bring their best self to work
Mm.
because families depend on us. So if I'm going to help them bring their best self to work, I need to be more in tune with what they're going through on a personal level. It's not just about checking in to see if they've completed their tasks. It's checking in to see what their state of mind is. Do they understand what they're part of? And do I really understand the things that are blocking them so that I can move them out of the way?
I really appreciate that. Now we're getting to rubber meets the road here for any leaders that are they understand the concept, they want to embrace the concept of bringing people along, rallying people, as you were talking about, towards the cause, towards the direction of where the organization is heading, where they want to head. And so you're talking about understanding what might be obstacles, what's going on in their lives. Is it your job I mean, this is rhetorical to some degree, but what's your job are you there to solve what's going on in their lives? Are you there to be the one to remove the obstacles? I want to get a little bit more prescriptive if you can share your thinking there.
So for me, my growth as a leader includes this recognition that I can't do everything. I've heard mentors describe that you've got doers and you've got leaders. They're different. Leading is not necessarily doing. So that if I dissect a little bit of what you described, Stephanie, is it's not my job to do the work for them. It's not even my job necessarily to solve their problems. That's their job. And I think for me, if I'm going to be most effective and best at being the CEO of the organization, I have to be able to delineate when should I do and when should I not. And so part of it's that is being discerning as leaders, knowing where you bring the best value in. And it's not by doing, it's by coaching and supporting. And then there's also this delineation between what you can control and what you can't control. Like for me to remove obstacles, I can remove obstacles within the organization and within the business environment, if you will, to a degree. But I don't believe I have the responsibility or even the power to remove the challenges that people are going through from a personal perspective. Now, I can certainly try to show empathy and support them and give them advice or counsel if they seek it, but it's not my job to solve that. So creating the right boundaries as a leader is really important. And that if you do that, then you're spending your energy in the very important places, the right places, versus expending energy in the wrong places. And for me, with the incredible number of failures that I go through every day in my job, I find that trying to lean in and solve for someone tends to be my kryptonite, if you will. I want to solve everything. That's not my job. And if I'm really going to do my job well, I got to tell myself to not do that. Don't lean in and do that. That's not what your job is. And that's not where your time is best spent. It's to really do this. Again, empower your people, let them do what you need to have them bring their best self to work, and then be patient and let them succeed.
So well said. So well said. It's so difficult because leaders are problem solvers. That's what and then those who have a great interest in helping others want to take the reins and fix it and make sure and sometimes can get confused by the idea that somehow they're helping, and they can be disempowering sometimes if they overfix, because if you want people to step up, the old adage, get off the step. And it's difficult to pull ourselves away from that. I appreciate that. So this is great for our listeners. I just think that this is these are the kinds of temptations that so often leaders are faced with, which is, do I stay detached and not get involved at all? Do I care and ask people, but what's mine to solve? What's theirs to solve? And how can I make sure they have the tools to be able to move forward and solve them? Tell me a little bit about some of those very tough choices in your leadership journey and possibly in your life. Tell me about times, if they can come to mind, where you were under great pressure, great risk, and potentially could lose it all, or at least lose something that felt very important to you, and how you managed to get through that.
I'll use a Northwest Center example right up front, and that is the vision is to create the inclusive world we all deserve by eliminating ableism. That is an enormous aspiration. If we're going to achieve that, we need to have all the right tools and all the right people to do that. So this really falls under the category of make sure you have the right people on the bus and make sure you have them in the right seat. So I've heard it described that way to me. And the challenge, the realization that I came to was that I had to make changes at some of the senior leadership level. And it's really hard to do. I think if you're going to make these really tough decisions and do a good job at it, you have to have a structure. I mean, for me, it's a moral compass. For me, it's a logic. And to oversimplify it for Northwest Center, it's that what is best for the organization, what is best for the division, and what is best for the individual. And again, I've gone my whole life realizing that going back to the sports analogy, you need to get the most out of your people. Like in my description, the team is Northwest Center. That's the most important. But if I don't attend to the individuals, then I'm not going to have the greatest team. But the progression has to be what's the most important thing for the organization, then the division, then the individual. And for me, seeing that I'd invested and tried to support the team that I had to achieve the strategic plan, the truth was we didn't have the ability as a team to do that. So I needed to make change. That's really hard on a human level it impacts individuals. It's not a value judgment of them as an individual at all. They're extraordinary human beings. But the truth is they weren't on the right bus in the right seat. And so that
Yeah.
was really difficult to go through. It took me a long time to get through that, but now we're through that. I have what I believe is an extraordinary team with enormous capability. It's my job to make sure that we can unleash that ability and achieve the strategic plan. So that was the most recent one from a career perspective. Was very hard to do. But again, you go back to as a leader, if you don't have a construct that you follow, then I'm not sure how you can be consistent with your decision making and to make these really hard decisions in a graceful way.
Well, I have the benefit of knowing that this was incredibly difficult for you. And I know have known some leaders over the years where letting people go isn't really hard for them necessarily. And so just talk to me a little bit about why it's so hard for you, why it was so hard for you. I understand the courage that you are describing that you use to move forward. I'm just curious about what goes on in your mind, in your heart, when you bump up against this kind of situation.
Well, specific to this, for me, it comes back to inclusion. And the way I would describe that is that people aren't as inclusive as they need to be because they don't have an open mind. they tend not to be curious or suspend disbelief. And so for me, I will spend more time on the individual and giving them the chance and the tools to be successful than others, because that's important to me that people are included. When I think of inclusion, I think of it on a human level. So yes, our organization is dedicated to ensuring that people with disabilities can live a full life and are included the way everyone else is. But inclusion's not, I don't approach it by demographic. So I don't approach it by, let's make sure everyone from a gender perspective is included, then from a race perspective is included, then from a disability perspective or national origin is included. I think the work that I push really hard is inclusion is a human thing. So for me to make sure that someone's not for the wrong reasons is
Yeah.
really important. And the truth
Mm,
is we all have good and we all have faults. So it's trying to find that right balance of what, again, for me, if I'll go back to the bus scenario, is that it's not always black and white on who belongs on the bus and who's not. You really have to think a lot about what are the puts and takes. Yes, they may have these focus areas or weaknesses, but they also have these gifts. So if they're in balance, they can be on the bus. But when they're not in balance, they have to be invited off the bus. So
mm,
for me, that's why it's hard. It's a human thing to go through, and it's a lot harder for, I believe, to evaluate all of those human components than it is necessarily just the dollars and cents or the productivity of number of widgets that someone can put out in a specified time.
thank you. Hey, that's helpful, and it helps me understand a little bit more about where that difficulty is coming from or was coming from inside of you. And it is hard. You got to spend time on it. And I know you were very thorough and just from our experience together. And at the same time, you did take the steps that you believed would help the organization and the people in the organization as a whole. And I think that's the balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the comment I would add to this too is that when you make the tough decisions and you can make what you would think is the right choice, that really everybody benefits. So even the people that departed, again, they were extraordinary human beings. I don't believe they were happy in the place they were in because they knew they weren't being successful. And I don't want to be in that position. I don't think anybody wants to be in that position. So even though it's difficult, I really do think that everybody wins if you can make the best decision. The people that are still there are that much more productive and that much more energized. And the people that departed, I believe, are going to find the right bus to be on, and they'll be in a much better space themselves once they're able to find that.
That's a great example. And I'm just curious, any other choice bubbles up for you? I think people need to understand how leaders think, but what prompts them to action and what motivates them, the ones that make those decisions with
Yeah.
heart and with success. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm smiling. There's a personal scenario that I'll give a little context to and then share that for my father, he was in a wheelchair for the last 25 years of his life. And I was in the Navy, traveling the world, and I was in Seattle. My parents were in Ohio. My family was in Ohio. And when I'd come back to visit, something as simple as let's go over to one of my siblings' houses. And I'd have my mom and dad would come with me. And my siblings would pull me aside and said, how did you get him to do that? We can't get him to go places. And I was like, well, did you ever ask him? And for me, it's like, there's no reason for him not to. I just assumed he would go. And I supported him. I asked him, what do you need to make sure that you're comfortable and that we're safely navigating, et cetera? All of this. So for me, I just kind of smiled. My siblings were like, how did you get him to do that? And I said, well, I just asked. I didn't make a big deal of it.
Yeah.
And I learned so much from my father. And from that, part of it was attending to what he needed to feel safe and to navigate, et cetera. But my father, for me, both of my parents gave me what I think all the tools that I needed to be successful in. And some of them, and the thread I'll tie is this idea of just don't panic. God gave you logic and reasoning and a way to think through problems. So just trust in Him, have some faith in Him and yourself, and you'll be able to work through just about any problem, if not every problem that you get. So I go back to that thought process from my father. quite a bit. But the scenario that I wanted to come back to that I find humorous is I live on the backside of, it's called Cougar Mountain, and my property has significant slope and it's forest. And I had driven my pickup truck down into my backyard, far into my backyard, because I was moving firewood. Well, it was wet and muddy, and I got my truck stuck
Stuck.
pretty badly. And so this was one of those, oh, this is hopeless. There's no way I'm going to get this thing unstuck without getting help. So now my mind moves to, okay, I'm going to have to go hire a tow truck that can actually get down and pull it out. And just, I was thinking of the enormous expense it was going to take to get my truck unstuck. And then I just tried to go back. I channeled my father and said, okay, just step back and suspend your disbelief and be curious and use your head for a minute. And so I'm standing there looking at my pickup truck that's stuck. And the thing that, unfortunately, the resounding theme that goes through my head too often is, what an idiot. What were you thinking? For me, it's what were you thinking? And so I think the other piece is that don't blame, if you're out to blame somebody, holy cow, wrong thing. And I think maybe I blame myself or feel guilt too much in that, but it's not about, for me, I also remember, even the organization, like I'm the one that got us to wherever we got. So this is on me, not on someone else. And so when you're just trying to rally the troops, I try to do that. This is not your fault. I try not to put the spotlight on and say, well, this is really my fault, although it might be. It's more, can you come into the arena with the energy of how are we going to solve this? Not who are you looking to point a finger at and blame, but are we going to solve this? I mean, that's for a leader, that's a really powerful, I think, a powerful tool for leaders to consider in all this. Because I've seen it. I think for me, a lot of my leadership qualities or the things I try to do have come from being led differently. I've had bad leaders treat me in a way that wasn't very motivating and didn't feel like leading. So I just try not to make the same mistakes they made. The quick ending to all of this was that I had sand and gravel in different part of my property. I got a bucket and started moving it. I didn't have to move a lot of it, but I moved enough to be able to get the truck unstuck and drive it off. So I didn't have to pay for a tow truck or anything. It was more, don't panic, use some logic, even though it doesn't seem hopeful or feel hopeful. At the end of the day, it had the outcome that I wanted. So, and that for me, from a faith perspective, is that trust in the process. That's why, for me as a leader, I have all of these people, I have all these perspectives. So for me, let's project confidence, or at the very least, not despair. This is really hard. Let's all think about how we might do this, get the ideas in place, and then take the steps forward to do it. So for me, it's fun to go back and remember that, because I do remember standing there looking at my truck going, this is just never going to happen. I have no idea how to get myself out of this. And yet I did.
That's such a great example, because this is like a recurring theme that I have noticed in great leaders, and that is that in the face of the impossible or the seeming impossible or the very expensive giant tow truck to come pull the truck out, they step back. They step back and start to relax and believe this can be solved through faith, through experience, through all the characteristics you've described. And it's one of those things that helps people get through what seems like impossible situations. And so you just illustrated it really well. Thank you for that. And I think that the lessons you shared in this conversation will be really valuable for new leaders, existing leaders, very experienced leaders. I so appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, Gene. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. To hear more conversations with leaders, please subscribe to The Toughest Choice wherever you listen to podcasts. For updates, please connect with me on LinkedIn. This is Stephanie Reynolds. Thanks for listening.